For more than 30 years, we've published unique stories, insights, and case studies, from neural machine translation to racial bias and localization.
Visit multilingual.com/subscribe and start reading today.
Welcome to the second installment of the 2021 Multilingual Summer Series, where we host conversations with thought leaders in globalization, localization, language access, translation, interpretation, and all things language. My name is Tucker Johnson, and I will be your host today to discuss certified deaf interpretation. I am the co-founder of Nimdzi Insights, a research and advisory firm helping companies and governments around the world level up their localization and language access strategies. Certified deaf interpreters provide an extra layer of accessibility in the standard ASL interpretation process. And I'm hosting this panel not because I'm the expert. I'm hosting this panel because I am not the expert. This is largely me playing the role of audience surrogate today, asking the questions that you want to know. So please, if you are watching this during the live stream or logging in through KUDO, make sure to put those questions into the comments section so that we can get to those. The last 30 minutes of this session will be reserved for audience questions. This session will be captioned. Human-generated captions will be provided for the recorded video, which will be made available at MultiLingual TV on MultiLingual Media's YouTube channel. Special thanks to our working sign language interpreters, Claire and Reid, today. These working interpreters serve two functions: facilitating conversation during the panel between panelists, and also facilitating communication between us and the audience. Because one of our panelists is a member of the deaf community, he will also be using a certified or an interpreter to help sign. And we have two interpreters on screen here today. We have Claire, who will be a voicing interpreter, who will be interpreting for Shawn as he signs. And we also have Reid, who will be communicating, signing, interpreting the English that the other panelists are speaking and signing it for Shawn. If you are listening as a podcast, please keep this in mind as there may be periods of silence between speakers. Today, this will be interpreted also into Spanish, French, Hindi, and Chinese via the KUDO platform. So big thanks to our friends over at KUDO for making this happen. If you've ever wanted to hear what American Sign Language sounds like in Spanish, now is your chance. Alrighty then, lastly, this session is sponsored by our gold sponsor, XTM, today. So big thanks to our friends over at XTM. And now that I think we've gotten all of that out of the way, we're going to jump right in here. Inclusivity and language access are gaining traction. Companies and various governmental and non-governmental agencies are really starting to look at how to be more inclusive and accessible for all, regardless of language, regardless of background, regardless of ability level. While one could say that the goal is to raise awareness of deaf interpretation, certified deaf interpretation, and what that means, I prefer to use the term to normalize that. And that is my goal for this conversation today, to normalize the role of the certified deaf interpreter. And we're going to do that with our panelists. So let's dive right in here. Danielle Meder joining us today. She runs vendor management over at ULG. Let's see here. Danielle Meder is the Senior Director of Quality Interpretations at United Language Group. She is a nationally certified American Sign Language interpreter with over 15 years experience, most of which have been in remote healthcare environments. Danielle is a licensed trainer of the Community Interpreter International from Cross Cultural Communication, CCC, and is currently co-authoring a textbook on remote interpreting for cross-cultural communication coming out later this year. So make sure that that is on your radar. Woo! She is passionate about advocating for quality and effective language access, communicative autonomy, and the advancement of interpreter training. Our second panelist today is Shawn Vriezen from AMN Language Services, formerly Stratus Language Services. Shawn is a native Minnesotan involved in a myriad of interests, including filming, acting, and volunteering with various organizations and boards. Shawn has been interpreting professionally since 2008, is one of 9 certified deaf interpreters in his home state, and has worked full-time as a medical interpreter in video remote settings since 2017. When available, Shawn contracts to provide interpreting services for his local community. He has co-presented several workshops in the biannual Deaf Interpreter Conference held in Oregon in 2019. In addition to his CDI, Certified Deaf Interpretation certification, Shawn is certified as a qualified mental health interpreter and is one of 4 CDIs holding both certifications in the U.S. So let's start with an introduction. I've introduced you, so I'm going to throw it over to you guys and let me know what I got wrong in that introduction. And not just about you guys, but about deaf interpretation. I want to start with Shawn here. Shawn, tell us, what is certified deaf interpretation and why is it needed?
Well, I could go on, but to summarize, a certified deaf interpreter tends to be somebody who works in collaboration with a hearing interpreter. Not always, but most of the time. Typically, we're going to be working in situations with language deprivation or with adults that have complex language needs, or in really nuanced situations where the benefit of our experience increases and improves the interpretation outcome. So we work with deaf people from a variety of backgrounds. We can work with individuals that have all sorts of needs, and we provide unique perspectives in a teaming setting. And then we, with our expertise, are able to work as a team to provide a better interpretation.
So just to clarify, when we're talking about providing a certified deaf interpretation, you mentioned working with another interpreter. And this is something that frankly took me longer than it should have to wrap my head around. Like, why are there two deaf interpreters? Danielle, let's throw this over to you, because your background as an ASL, a hearing ASL interpreter, you need to be able to recognize, like, when is a situation where I could bring in a certified deaf interpreter, or when can I do this on myself? Maybe you can speak to this a little bit.
Sure. So I think the first thing I'd want to say is that when you need a deaf interpreter, it has nothing to do with me as the hearing person, as the hearing interpreter, right? It's not because I'm a bad interpreter or because I can't make the interpretation work. It's about meeting that communication need for the deaf community and for the deaf users. And so all the situations that Shawn talked about, we have to be sensitive to those and then be able to bring in that deaf interpreter. Hearing interpreters are often the gatekeepers to deaf interpreters being brought in, certified deaf interpreters being brought in. So making sure that that ego gets put aside and we're aware of the hallmarks of when you should call in a certified deaf interpreter, and then letting folks like Shawn in to do the work with us. Yeah,
and this is Tucker speaking. I heard Shawn say that too. And well, I heard Claire say that too, is that the certain situations, under certain circumstances, like, what does that mean in reality? Like, let's dive into that a little bit, because I was completely clueless on this until I did a little bit of research to understand what the state of sign language is out there. So Shawn, what are some situations where a certified deaf interpreter will definitely add value, or definitely, I don't want to say like be required, but yeah, be required?
It's a great question. I have two typical settings that I go to. The first one is if somebody has old-fashioned signs, or like I'm going in person to a location. If somebody is an immigrant, if they don't have fluent ASL signing, they have maybe more gestures, maybe their language is challenging to understand when they try to express themselves, or possibly somebody doesn't have as fluent of language. That's kind of the classic model for when you use a certified deaf interpreter. Today, more and more, we're seeing other applications for certified deaf interpreters.
Progressive.
And there's progressively more opportunities for certified deaf interpreters today. So it's not just this narrow definition of where we use CDIs. We also see CDIs with individuals that are from other countries. Maybe their native language is not sign language. We have a lot more, around the world, there's over 240 different sign languages that are used. So sign language is not universal. Frequently, if somebody has all sorts of different backgrounds that they bring to their lived experience, they might not have fluent ASL. So ASL might not be an access point for them. A certified deaf interpreter is going to be great for making that communication happen. And we'll be using just a variety of modalities. They might have made do with lip reading or sim-comming or their written language. So they're just trying to put together the pieces of understanding, and a CDI can help bridge that gap. I think as a deaf person, I've accessed the world that way as well, visually, and I bring that component, and that's not a lived experience that a hearing interpreter is going to have. There's also incidental learning that individuals miss out on growing up as a deaf person, especially with limited access. This is all speaking to language deprivation. So this incidental learning that doesn't necessarily happen as a deaf person means that they have concepts that are missing for understanding contextual pieces of information. They might have visual information, but they might not have that contextual or incidental learning that happened throughout their childhood. So there's just lots of different things. There's a spectrum of information that I can provide. And again, a CDI is going to have that deaf experience, that deaf perspective, and is going to understand culturally what needs to happen to make understanding happen. And frequently that's the part that's missing with a hearing interpreter trying to interpret for a deaf person that has such a large fund of information gap. And that's a wonderful opportunity for a CDI. And again, there's lots of ways that using a CDI is going to be a benefit to the consumer. Really challenging situations, legal situations really benefit. Situations that might have catastrophic events if nuances are missed, medical, high stakes situations. We've done things like diabetic education where it's just an overwhelming, complicated concept that really has not been successful with previous interpretations. That calls for an interpreter that has that deaf lived experience, that deaf space. A lot of deaf people have felt overwhelmed walking into medical spaces. It's a room full of hearing interpreters. It's a room full of hearing people. Nobody's understanding that cultural piece. And so it can be overwhelming. So sometimes just having another deaf person there can be a very calming, supportive presence. It can help them bridge that gap and get that access they need to stop having misunderstandings happen, stop letting malpractice potentially happen in medical settings. There's just so many reasons why having a deaf person in the room, bringing the deaf perspective, is a real benefit. Also, just I've got that instinct as a deaf person. Another deaf person in the room as a professional is going to know what little things need to happen to make it work. Often deaf interpreters or certified deaf interpreters have been in these exact situations many times, so they just have a few more tools, a few more tricks to try, and they're ready to keep trying different things until they can make that communication work. And ultimately, that is going to be less expensive. There's a focus on cost, but when you've got somebody who can make communication happen, that is in the long run less expensive.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is Tucker speaking. I want to talk about costs, but not yet, because I don't want this to turn into a cost benefit. You know, accessibility and accessing the inclusivity is it gets tricky when we start bringing cost into that conversation. So let's save that for later. Stick with us if you're listening. You mentioned something. We keep talking about culture. And this keeps coming up, deaf culture, deaf lived experience. And someone coming from the outside, it's very hard, it's impossible for me to empathize or understand that. So I wanted to ask you about that. How much of deaf interpretation is about culture and how much is about language? Or are those the same thing? And I'll throw this one back to Shawn.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, it would be a challenge to separate the two. I think they coexist conceptually. Signing culture and sign language go hand in hand. And there are local signs. So when you think of ASL is associated with English speaking. Mm-hmm. There are sign languages that correspond and correlate to spoken Spanish or other spoken language communities. And so there's a cultural competence piece to that as well. And those are local and they're larger scale, but there's always that piece of deaf community, which borrows from and feeds back into the community in which they live. Frequently, something will be said, but then there's a subtext, there's another meaning. And again, that would be a benefit of a certified deaf interpreter. If somebody is mad or overwhelmed or having conflict with the medical provider, sitting down with a certified deaf interpreter, like I had one instant, like you're trying to take my money again. But the message there isn't necessarily about money. It's not about paying. It's really about hearing people taking advantage of deaf people. So financial explanation is a code for distrust between the hearing and the deaf community. And if you can clarify conceptually what's going on, you can get to the roots of what that conflict is and help communication and happen. And as a deaf person, I know this internalized experience of oppression, of misunderstanding, of being left out, and I can bring that cultural component to my interpretation, and I can understand what that frustration stems from and help navigate getting there, because that conflict gets in the way of communication happening. And it's a really difficult gap to bridge. And that's what cultural competence means kind of in any two communities that are bringing together.
Excellent points. Danielle, I'd like you to weigh in on this too, because I believe it was a previous conversation that I was having with you offline where you opened my eyes by pointing out the fact that you are not a native ASL signer, right? Because you're hearing. What does it take to be native? How do the definitions of nativity, fluency, and mother tongue, so to speak, how do those apply or don't apply to signed languages?
Sure. So I'll echo what Shawn was saying before about that lived-in experience. So sign language and being deaf is all he knows. And so from that experience where I have learned sign language, right? I've been learning sign language since I was 10. And I grew up in Rochester, New York, huge deaf population, so surrounded by deaf people, but I still had the luxury of going between the spoken world, the hearing world, and then the deaf world. And so there's a layer there that I'll never understand. And so to Shawn's point, having that lived-in experience influence, just like being a native speaker. I wish a native speaker of Italian, but I will always be a student of, that there's just a intimacy with language that I won't have when it's your second language. That is just doesn't fly off my hands the way it would for Shawn or any other deaf person. So I will always be a second language learner. There's CODAs, Children of Deaf Adults. There's that new movie that came out with Marlee Matlin that I think everyone should watch just to get a window. It doesn't represent all CODAs, but it's a good window and just shows even kids who were born to deaf parents, their first language is usually sign language because their parents use sign language, but even still they have that English layer that they can speak and navigate in that world that deaf folks don't, and that adds such value and intimacy to language use when you're interpreting.
You bring up children, and this is one of the questions that I was talking about with someone prior to this panel about that might come up on here. What is the role of interpretation for children? Are there special practices around that? Because when we think of ASL interpretation, all of the times that I've seen it employed and used has been in quote unquote like adult settings. But Shawn, you're also a behavioral health interpreter, certified in that. Have you worked with children? Are there special practices in working with children? And how does the role of a CDI specifically change? Does it increase the need for a certified deaf interpreter when working with younger populations? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I work with all ages. I've worked with young, the elderly, everything in between. Everyone has different language. Language isn't universal, and different people have different language needs. And of course, younger consumers, kids, are going to have special language needs as well. Some kids aren't as good with finger spelling. If they can't spell words, finger spelling a word to them isn't going to help. They might not have as fluent of a vocabulary yet. So again, having a CDI there, understanding that spectrum of fluency or language where they're at, a CDI can go to the really earlier end of beginning language fluency and can really help understand what somebody's trying to say when they only kind of have language to use. And when you're working with somebody with emergent language, it can be really critical to meet them where they are with what language they do have. There's also the concept of home signs. If you have somebody who hasn't really extensively socialized with the community at large, they might have a very developed dialect that's more specific just to the immediate members of their family or people they sign with. And they might have developed coded ways of saying things or their own little signs for things. And they might be very primitive if they have limited access to other people who can sign. So those might all be potential challenges that we would find with any of our consumers. Every time you meet a new person, it's going to be a different situation of learning who they are and how to accommodate their language needs. And it can You have to factor in their background, where they've been. There's so many things that go into evaluating how you meet a consumer's language needs. And we have a similar experience with people that are hearing. If a hearing person has had, say, a stroke, they might have a hard time with pronunciation because they can't move the muscles of their mouth to enunciate with their lips or their tongue. Similarly, if somebody has an issue with their hand, they might not have fluent production of signs with their hands. So that's another challenge that might come up that we would have to learn how to interpret.
And this is Danielle, I'll add, especially in K-12, you'll have hearing interpreters. They become the language models for these deaf kids. And if they are not raised in homes that are fluent in ASL or have deaf language models outside of school, then you have hearing interpreters whose native language typically is not going to be sign language, being a language model to this rising generation of deaf kids.
Yeah, and that brings up this ASL as a structured language. Is ASL a natural language, American Sign Language, or is it a constructed language? Is it, because it's not a very old language, and based upon the very limited research I did of preparing to ask you guys questions about this, it hasn't been around more than 200 years as a formalized language from my understanding. So how much of it is actually structured and codified? And like, this is it. Here's another way of asking this question. Is there a correct way to use American Sign Language?
I'll answer that. Yes and no.
Excellent. Moving
Better
on.
you than me, Shawn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because you brought up home signs, Shawn. Yeah. And home signs for those that are listening are essentially, think of it as like, correct me if my understanding is incorrect, but basically like slang that you make up at home because you're not exposed. Like no one's ever taught you what the official ASL sign is for cookie, children will figure out how to ask for a cookie regardless of their language abilities. So what happens is they develop these home signs at home, which could be hard to interpret for just a standard hearing ASL interpreter. And so that's where the use of a certified deaf interpreter comes in. So how do you figure that out? How do you understand what those home signs are? Oh, and I'm sorry, I got my own little cookie monster here. How do you figure out what those home signs are if you didn't grow up in that environment?
That's a great example. Let me think of one. You have families that have multi-generational signs, and then over time the sign evolves. So the original sign for phone looked like a speaker and an earpiece, and then it has evolved to look like what phones look like, with little tiny iPhones or something that's not have a cord. We used to reference putting the phone down in the cradle when we signed telephone, and now it's just a thing we pick up and hold to our ear and speak into. Similarly, signs might evolve over time. 30, 40 years ago, what's a proper sign for something changes. There's also local, different regional signs and dialects. And as ASL spreads throughout the education system, we see signs evolve as well. In the 1800s, when we were establishing the first schools for the deaf, there were these very concentrated language populations, right? You have a deaf kid, you'd send them to school, and they would become a community that was very close-knit, and they would develop signs within that community. So these localized pockets of language users would develop their own signs, and they were very specialized and almost bottlenecked. But that was the key to them getting education and having community. And we had a teacher from France that came, this was Mr. Gallaudet. He invited a teacher from the deaf, that was Laurent Claire, and so we had some influence of French Sign Language. And so of course that influenced American Sign Language. Trying to think of an example I can show you. So to see, in English, that started to influence us. And then over time, ASL community would make decisions. Yes, we want to sign it this way, or we want to sign it more as English, or we want this to match with what it looks like when you're mouthing or saying the word in English. But there is an important distinction to make, which is C, which is signed exact English, is not ASL. ASL itself is a very organic language that has developed naturally over time, collectively. And when we try to make changes to it, Like if you remember the movie Jurassic Park, life finds a way, language finds a way. That's the same thing with language. And you can try to force sign language to be more like English. You can try to force it to evolve in a certain way, but it's going to do what it's going to do, and it's going to be organic, and it's going to flow around barriers, and it's going to develop the way it wants to. So who knows what ASL is going to look like in the future? We can't make it be what we want it to be. But we do know that there's influences of generations of signers, technology is influencing sign language, and the way language communities use language will evolve it over time.
This is Danielle. I'd have to imagine the rabbit hole you went down on TikTok, Tucker, for deaf TikTok, right? And how that is spurring language evolution and just how we're communicating the signs we're using. I know as an interpreter, I follow deaf TikTok to learn the signs, right, that are being created, that come from the deaf community, that evolve through the deaf community so that we can stay present with the language. It's just the technology piece has really spurred that language evolution and development.
Yes, thank you for outing me that I did all of my research for this panel moderation on TikTok. But there is some very interesting stuff on TikTok about, hashtag deaf TikTok, and you can find some very educational, very interesting stuff. And, we're going from a situation, we've evolved as a society, as a globe, however you want to say it, from a situation where it's like 200 years ago that, okay, let's send your deaf children to this farmhouse in this remote, and we're going to teach them and, build the community there. And it was this very manual thing to like, oh, wow, anybody can learn about the deaf community. Anybody can go out there and learn more about this community. And I'm wondering, and this is a question for Shawn, what impact is that having on the signing community and the deaf community, that you guys are kind of being outed, right? Like what used to be a exclusive club is being more, there's more awareness. Is this a good thing in the form of awareness, or does this pose any threats, hidden threats, you think, to the signing and deaf communities?
I think there's positives and negatives. I think something unique about ASL versus spoken language is that we've really seen an explosion of it recently because we don't have a written form of sign language. So unlike English, where you can disseminate books or publish things, we didn't have that for sign language. ASL is a visual language. So previously there was no way to record it, to document it, to put it out there. So there was generations where the only way that language was transmitted was by word of mouth, as it were, on hands. But now we've got video. That's a big change. Recording videos. We're in that technology age. Look at us. We're 5 pictures on a screen going to the internet. So you don't have to be in the same room now. Technology lets us be connected globally. That's a benefit, and it's also a challenge. And it's the same thing that English has to deal with, because there are some negatives, the way that language is out there now. And we see ASL influencing other languages, which might not be a good thing. So there's ways in which other language communities want to preserve the pure forms of their language, and ASL might be negatively influencing their language.
And this is Danielle, I'll add. So what's happened more with technology and social media is you see the hearing community that may not be connected to the deaf community all fetishizing sign language and then making videos using sign language when they're not from the deaf community, plugged into the deaf community. No one walks up to a Spanish speaker and says, oh my gosh, just say your grocery list in Spanish, please. Like, no one cares. But like when you find out you know sign language, or you're an interpreter, you're deaf, like, oh, sign something. And immediately it's beautiful. When really it's a language, it's a community, it's a culture, and then the hearing appropriation of sign language. There was a New York Times article that just came out last week that talked about that, where hearing interpreters are here to provide access, not entertainment. And that's how sign language, I think now how accessible it is and how easily it can be picked up. And you have baby sign for hearing babies by hearing parents, the exploitation of sign language. So that outing of them, of taking their language and their culture and using it for gain. I mean, the shirts they sell at Target that say LOVE on them and sign, like that didn't come from a deaf creator, but they're using the deaf community's language for profit without giving that back to the community. So I think that's been the negative impact of the evolution of sign language and media, and just how easy it is, how accessible it is now.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is Tucker speaking, and this is not something unique to sign language, to ASL or anything. This is something, there's a big debate right now happening within the industry, the language services industry as a whole, on who owns languages, who owns tribal languages. There's a discussion about like the Mapuche tribe down in Chile. We've been talking about the Maori, like who owns data that's been collected about Maori language over in New Zealand. And, there's court cases and also cases of public opinion raging on right now. So ASL being a language is not immune from that. But I want to call out a specific thing. English, and specifically to Shawn, do you consider English to be a native language to you, or is English a second language after signing? And when I say English, obviously I'm speaking about written English, because for obvious reasons.
Honestly, for me, both feel like equally native languages to me. I was immersed in writing, and I feel as comfortable writing as a hearing person. My language fluency in English is comparable to a hearing person. I've also studied extensively as a CDI, so I feel comfortable and confident in both of my native languages and in both cultures, because what I'm doing is a cultural exchange, so I have to understand the perspective of both consumers or all consumers. And I'm fortunate that I have had access to both worlds growing up. Many deaf people do not, and that can be a greater challenge. But I feel like I can walk between those worlds. So I feel like I'm good with both.
So that's you. That's excellent. Thank you very much. This is Tucker speaking. Sorry. And Danielle, you in your position as so you head up vendor management over at ULG, and you're in a position where you frequently have the opportunity to advocate for language access and educate people about language access. That's what you're doing here today, right? So when you're in such a situation, like how do you make recommendations on what modality of to use, and moving away from the certified deaf interpretation just a little bit here and speaking to the larger, how do I provide accessibility to signing in deaf communities? Let's talk about captions versus signing, because we're talking about written English as a form of communication. When are captions okay? Sufficient? When do they need to be supplemented by a signing interpreter? And because we're talking about captions, I'm specifically talking about video, live and recorded video content.
Sure. I think captions are always necessary. And I think an interpreter with captions is always necessary. Sign language users are across the whole spectrum, like Shawn said. I also think as captions is a gift, and to folks whose native language is not English, so listening to someone speak in English and then see the captions. I've learned like that's such a gift for me when as a student of Italian, right? I can listen to someone in Italian, but when I can read the captions in Italian, I actually pick up more than what I just listened to. So I don't see captions as an exclusive deaf accommodation. I see it as a language accommodation for everyone. But it would depend on the venue. I think for this, you need captions and an interpreter. For the public announcements with coronavirus, hurricanes, fires, press conferences, you need an interpreter and you need captions. It just fills that whole spectrum of language use and a level of comfort.
And with the signing, this is Tucker throwing this to Shawn. With the signing, I don't know if it's just because I've been talking to you guys and preparing for this panel, but I've noticed an increase in the amount of signing that I see on TV, whether it's from the White House or whether it's from local. I know, right? So, but I don't know if that's just me or if we're actually seeing an increase. Are we seeing an increase in visibility for ASL interpretation, or is that just in my head, Shawn?
Yes. It's not just your observation. There's language access in general, and specifically people are using CDIs more and more. I'd like to go back to talk about something you said a little earlier, this spectrum. When you've got a hearing person speaking, and then you've got somebody signing, and you've got captions, especially in the situation of like time-sensitive emergency broadcasts or public announcements, having access for everyone, having a deaf person be able to watch that message and understand what to do is so critical. You expand who gets to understand that message in an immediate way when you have a CDI and you've got captions. And it's not just about hand shapes or the signs, it's about body movement, it's about speed, it's about the way you manipulate your face for facial expressions. That's all grammatically relevant, and it helps increase understanding in the audience. So having a deaf person there that has more expressiveness isn't necessarily depending on just signs, but is also doing linguistic things with their body language and their face, really increases comprehension for critical messages.
I mean, this is Danielle. It's like listening to a non-native English speaker be your interpreter for something. I mean, having the deaf person out there as the CDI is the native deaf sign user, it just brings a whole nother layer of accessibility and that lived experience, and for those critical moments, and not just pandemics and weather, but as Shawn mentioned earlier, getting a fatal diagnosis, or you're having a serious conversation, a legal matter, or anything where there's just a lot on the line, or where you feel like you're the only deaf person here and how can I possibly have my autonomy? That's when you need that deaf interpreter. It just provides so much more access. Even if it's a hearing interpreter, I could do the best job I possibly could. A CDI will do it better.
This is Tucker. Thank you, Danielle. Just to clarify, though, because this is something that I personally need to clarify. A CDI would not be ever really add value to like a televised announcement or something, like a governor giving an address or something, right? And I'm asking because in my idea, a CDI is one-on-one. It's working with individuals' home signs and dialects and really engaging with them. But it wouldn't work from like a one-to-many interpretation situation. Or am I wrong in that?
You're wrong.
No.
I'm wrong. Please inform. I love being wrong because that's where we get to learn.
We'll teach you the sign today. Wrong.
Wrong. All right. Tell me how I'm wrong.
Shawn, go ahead.
Let me think of an example. I went to China. I was part of a group that was doing a delegation that was doing work there. And they hadn't met a lot of deaf people. They hadn't been exposed to the deaf community. I was the one deaf interpreter working with all of them. And so we had a meeting. We're all sitting around. Americans, deaf Americans, mixed group. Yes.
Sorry, go on. Sorry. I wanted to ask, who are you signing for, Chinese or Americans? I haven't perfected the art of interrupting people who in signing yet. So sorry for that.
I can clarify. So a delegation of Americans, high-level deaf members of organizations, went to China to work with their deaf and hearing communities, to help work with their language development, with their deaf community. So we're sitting around having a conversation. We're sitting at a table. Deaf Americans, Americans on one side, Chinese on the other side. And there was one hearing interpreter standing further back. And so the way we were structured in the room, the person who was speaking was standing further back, interpreting in Chinese, and then watching the sign language, and then I would be, again, interpreting it to be more accessible. So that was, even with having and this was a population of high-level, executive, deaf individuals, but this was a high-stakes communication, and it was many of them, and so there was still misunderstandings that were happening. And the Americans were really struggling to understand what was going on, and you watched their faces were really twisted up with trying to understand and trying to follow the language. But then when they all sat in a row and we had a CDI that was taking the translation and able to interpret it again with a cultural piece, more understanding was happening. And so a CDI can take an interpretation such as it is, move pieces around, make it more accessible, put it into native language, clean it up as it were, really just polish up that product. And then that means that the listener just gets to do the listening piece, not once again interpreting in their head and then trying to understand and take in the information at the same time, which can be exhausting. So having a deaf interpreter there, especially in like foreign language situations or other countries with just complex levels of cultural competence, can really be a wonderful experience and can add to that.
Can I add? So Minnesota has a phenomenal CDI, Nick Zapko. She's the one who's been interpreting along Governor Waltz in Minnesota during the pandemic. She's a CDI, and she's been working with a team of hearing interpreters that are sitting behind the camera, interpreting what they're hearing from the governor to Nick. The deaf community in Minnesota, or whoever's watching it, may use sign language to varying degrees. And so the way she will interpret it will have the greatest impact to the deaf community's different uses and levels of, the different ways in which they're communicating with their versions of sign language. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot more sense than it does when I came into this.
Yeah.
So because I came into this.
Yeah, because we don't all speak English the same way, right? We all communicate differently. And so you're using a deaf interpreter. Are you good, Shawn?
I'm having a little bit of freezing from my sign interpreter, Ree, but. One example of an interpreting challenge, right? Technology influencing language use.
No, but.
But again, if this happens, having a native signer might help bridge that gap. I might still understand what's going on because it's my first language.
Well, and let's just stop for a moment here because Ree froze. And once again, Ree is a working interpreter. Her role on this panel is not to be a panelist, but to make sure that Shawn understands everything that I say and everything that Danielle says verbally, right? And she just froze for 5 seconds. And because this is a panel about interpretation and about the role of interpretation and what it means to have an inclusive communication, we all can stop and say, oh, haha, look, it froze. This is an example. And we can call that out and we can work around it and say, Shawn, did you get everything? Right? Pretty much virtually all situations out there that we go into aren't like this though. So we would just keep going and the deaf person would be trying to catch up. So I think this is actually a great example of a reason like why it makes sense to have a deaf person in the room and what we're talking about. What Shawn's talking about when he says like from a cultural standpoint and from like he's hyper aware of things that other people wouldn't be aware of. That's something that I wouldn't be aware of, right? I just keep plowing through and with the presentation.
That's why you also need live captions. This is Danielle. Adding captions so that if you are, let's say you're doing a national or a weather or COVID announcement from the governor's office, having an interpreter and the captions help for when technology fails one or the other.
So there's an element of redundancy there. Thank you, Danielle.
I'm gonna add something.
Shawn?
And Ree does keep freezing, and it seems to be resolving. Maybe we can switch interpreters. Maybe we could have Ree do the voicing for the rest of this panel and Claire can do signing. Would that work? Let me see if that'll work.
Talk amongst yourselves. For those listening right now, the panelist and the interpreters are signing to each other to figure out who will be interpreting. At least I think that's what they're talking about.
Ree, can you speak really quickly and see if we can hear your voice?
This is Danielle. I hear you.
Are you able to hear? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yep, I hear you.
Great.
Let us know when we're good to go.
I think we're set.
Awesome. Well, let's move on. So we got 15 minutes left, and then I want to get in to see if there's any questions from the audience here. But I want to talk about the balance. So recently in MultiLingual Magazine, there was an article that was published by William Dan. He's an MA student at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. And he was talking, the point put forth in this article is that we as an industry have been behind the scenes for so long, and a good interpreter is one that stays in the background, blah, 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 blah. But yet, these opinions are changing. So in my book, in the general theory of the translation company that I wrote and published with my co-author, I actually even say the words like a good translation is one that you don't even know exists. Like translation is only bad that you should only find out about translation and interpreting. My book's about translation though. You should only find out about translation or when it goes wrong. Right? A good translation is not noticed. You just think it's native. And how does that apply over into the interpreting space? And Danielle, because you have the background with translation, interpretation, and more of the corporate side too on this, should translation be invisible? Should interpretation be invisible? And should ASL not be invisible? Perhaps is the wrong adjective, but should it be in the background or should it be called out to the foreground?
So for translation, that's not necessarily happening live, right? We're talking about, text that's been created, handed over to the translator, and they get to work with it. Interpretation is always live. I just did a training yesterday, and I verbatim said, you are not invisible. You can't ignore the extra voice in the room or the extra interpreters in the room. You are not invisible, but your effectiveness is determined by everyone having authentic communication and communicative autonomy. And communicative autonomy being you are responsible for and in control of everything you're saying. So a good and effective interpreter is facilitating that happening. You can't ignore the voice, just like the RSI interpreters that are working right now. You can't ignore the fact that you need an interpreter and that you could hear their voice. You can't ignore the fact that you can see Claire and see Ree. But does Shawn feel like he has his own communicative autonomy, that he's saying what he wants, when he wants, and how he wants? That would be for him to tell us. And do I feel like I have that? I do. And so we happen to need interpreters, and it's only cumbersome, it's only a problem when those interpreters are prohibiting that communicative autonomy and the authentic connections that people can have through language.
I think I want to take this a little bit further. In terms of being visible or not visible, and talking about being unseen, your goal is to get that meaning, that tone within that interpretation. And there has to be an understanding. So when you take this information and then interpret it, that creates a fit that allows for the interpretation to actually occur. So if you have something within hearing culture in English, and there's that direct interpretation without any of that adjustment to accommodate the other language, that can be non-effective. You have two different cultures, English culture and deaf culture. Mm-hmm. The goal of the two languages may be the same, but there may not be that connection that allows the same message to be communicated. So you have to have that link, and the interpreter is there to facilitate such. And so if you have a speaker providing that and they're able to provide that facilitation and that link to get both of these entities to understand and connect, then you have that autonomy. If that breaks down, then that's where the problem begins.
But there is this concept in training that interpreters need to be invisible, like we're in the shadows, and like, no, I'm here. Like, you can't ignore me. I'm here. But as my skill set, and because not all interpreters are created equal, not all interpreters belong in every situation. So knowing yourself and knowing your limitations and your skills, and then putting yourself in encounters or in environments where your skill set is best suited for that kind of communication, that's great. It's when the interpreter is not well suited, not experienced enough, trained properly, doesn't have the skill set or the specialty, then their presence becomes a hindrance because they're not able to work effectively and do what Shawn said.
And we've seen high profile cases of this in the news where I don't know in America, maybe you guys know examples, but I remember, I think it was South Africa where there's like a fake interpreter. What was that? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Shawn.
Oh, yeah. I remember that situation. It was for Nelson Mandela's funeral memorial, and there was an interpreter up the top, or seemingly to be an interpreter, who was standing up, supposedly interpreting, and there were deaf people there, and we had a lot of legal jargon, etc., and they had security present because of that. Now, because there was a person there, they just assumed, well, okay, you're an interpreter, you're fine, you can sign. And so, they told them to sign as much as possible because they didn't have an interpreter prepared beforehand. And, the situation was resulting in deaf frustration because they had no power to actually speak up and change that. So now, because of that situation, we're seeing a lot of international attention drawn to that. And that interpreter, provided an exposure that showed what was going on. People saw that and previously would have had no idea that that was going on, but now it's in front of them and they're seeing that this person was just inventing signs, and talking about, the need to know and know sign language, but he got up there, had no idea what he was doing. His signing wouldn't matter what country it is. Signing has certain structures. There are certain ways in which you form language on your hands, and he had none of that. And so that was something we were all exposed to. So now we're able to see this, and we are noticing those issues occur. And the issue, though, is that it again gets seen by everybody. And so when you see that, that creates a result of positives and negatives. We've got exposure, people are seeing it, they're aware of it. And so that's one big positive, is we're able to see what's going on and, understand that that person may not have the skills. They're standing up there as an interpreter, and we're talking about a national stage here in which the person is standing up there. And so people are seeing that. And obviously when that occurs, they will complain. Now, there are times in which, they can't find an interpreter, they're not sure what to do, and they'll just pick out somebody and say, hey, do you know a little bit of sign, and get a person up there, and they'll have everything dressed nicely, the appearance is good, but they're not interpreters. They're not deaf ASL interpreters. They wear the inappropriate things. Instead of wearing colors that are good for people to see, they'll have clashing bright colors on. You have to wear things that contrast your skin color. So there's all these different things that interpreters have to be aware of. And, for example, maybe you don't want to wear white because the palms of your hand appear white and you're not able to see it. And so, they have to have all these things set up in advance and be ready, and the appropriate interpreter will do such. And those standards have to be set. And that exposure to different situations, I think, is helping shift the view and allowing this to occur the way it should.
This is Danielle. From a vendor perspective, especially in large cities, there's no excuses for those things to happen anymore. I mean, we have interpreter training programs and interpreters, whether sign language or spoken. There are ways to vet interpreters, and it's taking seriously that language access is, in a healthcare environment, a social determinant of health. There's a health equity risk if you don't honor language. When we're talking about life and death situations with hurricanes, fires, and coronavirus, the stories are countless of the wrong interpreters or unqualified interpreters being used. And so there has to be this commitment to actually focusing on language access as a human right, as an equitable, necessary piece. Bill Rivers said last year, we're the biggest industry in Capitol Hill that nobody knows anything about. We're a mandated industry in healthcare, but we're unfunded. So look at what happens. You have quality concerns left, right, and center, and who's really going to hold anybody accountable? That was the Florida interpreter, wore a yellow shirt, flip-flops, and was interpreting for a hurricane. But who's going to hold, I don't know what city in Florida it was, so I don't want to misname it, but who's going to hold that city in Florida accountable for hiring someone who probably did more harm than good in their interpretation?
And this brings us, sorry, I can't see who's signing if I'm interrupting. Okay, I'm not. This brings us nicely to my next question about certification. Shawn, you are a certified deaf interpreter. What does that first letter in your title mean?
Yes, I am certified, which means that I'm under a national registry, which is RID, the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. And they have their own requirements. For example, you must have at least 40 hours of training in interpreting to pursue this. And then there has to be 180 hours of specific interpreting. You are supposed to also have a minimum of an associate's degree. I believe now it's up to a bachelor's degree. You also have to pass a written examination. And there's an examination that also is provided in sign as well as written. Now, if you pass that written test and all goes well, then you move on and you must pass a performance test. So really, most of the deaf community who is pursuing certification finds the written part the most challenging. You know, and once you get all those steps completed, then you can pass and become a nationally certified interpreter. You know, we're talking about minimal skill requirements to then, you know, enter the profession. And that's where you can develop and kind of continue to increase your skills.
And there's currently a difficulty, this is Danielle speaking, currently difficulty in taking the CDI exam just because of availability and just issues over at RID. So there's a growing pool of CDIs, but there's also a growing pool of regular deaf interpreters trying to get certified, and because of bureaucracy and testing development and everything else, they're having a hard time getting that letter, that C. And so in hearing sign language interpreters, we have coveted that C because we've had a test available for dozens of years and it's evolved. And so there's lots of certified interpreters. So I pride myself on that that I am a certified American Sign Language interpreter. But for the deaf community, it's unfortunate the struggle that they're having because there are fantastically experienced and skilled deaf interpreters who can't get that C yet. Doesn't mean every deaf interpreter should be certified, just like every American Sign Language hearing interpreter should be certified, but they're facing a really uphill challenge right now in getting access to the test, the results, and scoring, and all of that just because of a lot of things beyond their control.
This is Tucker. I'm going to avoid getting into the certification debate because we got 4 minutes left, and I would like to get to some of these great questions we got from the audience here. But ending it up here, lastly, I want to go around and I'll talk from the perspective of where I'm at. I'll talk from the perspective of a company owner or the media. Right? Mm-hmm. Like, how can the media, multilingual media, how can we be doing a better job? But I want to ask Shawn's perspective from the signing community, Danielle, your perspective from the supply chain, the vendor community, right? The provider community, on what can we be doing? What should we be doing differently? What should we stop doing? Open question, but with the goal of making sure that our content, our messages, our services, whatever, are accessible to people. So, Shawn, what can members of the deaf community, what can members of the signing community be doing? For example, like, how can someone request a certified deaf interpreter? Can they request a certified deaf interpreter? I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, I think a good start is I'm very lucky to work for a company, and so there's a lot of advocacy in terms of getting hospitals, agencies, et cetera, to provide such. And those standards are something we're trying to get in process. You know, as Danielle already mentioned, there are hearing interpreters who are the gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. So they create this barrier at times in which they may decide whether or not to even call on me. Now, because of that, ability to communicate, et cetera, and a situation comes up, I can be called upon. And that's when it's great because that in-demand moment of immediately needing to pop up happens. And then I can pop up and facilitate that information. Maybe it's a sticky situation. Maybe it involves a death. Just so many different reasons in which I would be needed. And so having that support and having that be standardized, which it has yet to become, would be helpful. And that's why our process, in terms of introducing the challenges and seeing where we can resolve those and become equal as other interpreters. And that benefits everybody, spoken language, of any language, really. I want to become a need. I want to be a service that they must have. So for me personally, being involved in helping improve those services, it benefits the families, the communities, et cetera. And, people who know more than one language, that's one thing. But as far as a deaf interpreter, there may be things in which they are not able to supply, and I have to be there to provide that mediation or facilitation, I should say. So when you have a hearing interpreter and a CDI, and there's that request, sometimes it may not be possible because of limited availability. CDIs, you know, they work full-time jobs, possibly in another profession. Maybe there's not enough certified. Maybe there aren't enough people who are trained, and they haven't had enough work, you know, to continue on full-time. And the vendors themselves, they can hire, you know, when they're thinking about whether or not they want to hire 1 or 2 interpreters, it's tough because a lot of times they contact the agency and, you know, the communication is that, well, we don't need a CDI. They think everything's standardized. And so it's a work in progress where you have to change that thought and then look at, you know, how it was set up prior to that, looking at what we need in order to have a qualified interpreter. And then the community, you know, whether it be a CODA, a child of a deaf adult, or a hearing person who's a part of the deaf community, all of us are involved amongst one another, and they're learning ASL. And, you know, once they get an approval that they have that skill, they can become an interpreter. And so there's a shift from before being able to have anybody interpret to having a national certification. So we're looking at a lot less incidences of people who are not qualified, not certified. And so there's all these different things that need to be a part of that. And it's almost like a checklist in which you're looking at what you need. And a lot of that involves education. And you need to have an expansion of deaf interpreters for which these situations happen. Maybe, you know, that person, as I said before, grew up without ASL. You know, maybe there are some things that are missing, you know, and it just happens sometimes. There's a lot of times, like, for example, say a person has a stroke and there's a lack of understanding with the hearing interpreter. You know, there's a whole lot of different needs for deaf people to cover. For example, if someone passes away and all the different things that need to be communicated. And so we have to see that, you know, need met because it's increasing every day. And I think the more that we change our view on that, it improves the interpreting within itself. And you'll find that deaf people in general, you know, for example, you may have a country in which there are not, Claire, would you mind filling in for the interpreter? Thank you.
The point I'm trying to make is similar to spoken language. Like, we could be talking about Spanish, we could be talking about different language. That language community represents a culture and represents another country. And wherever you're speaking from, they're going to have their own languages, their own cultures. That's not quite the same thing with the deaf community. Deaf people don't live in a deaf country. They live all over the place, sometimes isolated, sometimes exposed to their own culture that they overlap with. So every deaf person is going to bring such a different background. Yes, they bring the deaf experience, but they also have such unique challenges because deaf people are not a monolith. And so we are often doing the work of providing access to who they are because the media just doesn't understand how nuanced we are. The media understands, oh, you're from here, that's your identity. This is where you're from. You're deaf. You need an ASL interpreter. And that today means a hearing interpreter. But a hearing interpreter is not going to understand that spectrum of the lived experience. They're just going to interpret. They're going to do the interpreting they do every day. But a deaf person is going to understand that lived experience, which is different and unique to every deaf person. And then you have to meet that person and meet them where they are. Or you have to interpret for all deaf people, which is such a spectrum. And you're trying to do that multi-accessible, broad kind of interpretation so that you have as much exposure and you have as much understanding as possible for a large audience.
This is Tucker. Before we move on to Danielle, thank you very much, Shawn. Before we move on to Danielle, are there any city, county, state, countries that have regulations or policies in place? I'm not even going to be ambitious and ask about mandates. But any policies in place recommending or informing or educating even about deaf interpretation?
Was that to me or to Danielle?
That was to Shawn. Sorry.
I thought the question was to Danielle. Can you ask that again?
Oh, are there any municipalities, city, state government, local or federal government that mandate or recommend or even just educate and inform about deaf interpretation that you are aware of?
For deaf interpreters, let me think. Frequently, maybe on an individual agency level, maybe some communities are better at advocating. Maybe you've got somebody, maybe you have a state with a strong commission that advocates for deaf rights. Different states also have different licensures or different requirements. There is a national certification, but there's plenty of places that don't have nationally certified interpreters. And so individual states get to determine what qualification means for them, and they'll kind of bring in whoever they can get. And then that brings in other problems with certification and national standards. There's not one fit.
Okay.
It works everywhere. And so interpretation and qualification is such a varied beast in our field.
Sure.
I will say for deaf interpreting, the state of Massachusetts, I happen to know the state of Massachusetts has a requirement for under 18. They want to have deaf interpreters working in partnership with hearing interpreters because they've discovered that the population that is under 18, they should have the right to choose if they're going to have a deaf interpreter there. And they've determined, after much fighting and advocating for that, providing that kind of language access, if consumers request it, has a huge benefit. It has benefits to advocacy, it has benefits to empowerment, and we're hoping other states will look to that model.
Awesome. Thank you very much. All right. I had to ask Danielle. Yeah.
And that's a perfect segue. What I would say, the same question you asked before about what the media can do is from a vendor perspective, right? If a deaf consumer says, I need a CDI, the only answer back should be, okay. If a hearing interpreter comes to you and says, this warrants a CDI, the response should be, okay. Those people asking for CDIs know their language needs and know their access needs, and those should be respected. And so there should be a relationship amongst the deaf community or the client or the customers that you're working with, that there's trust. And then if they're not asking for CDIs ever, that should be a moment for you to go, do they understand the role of a CDI? Have they ever worked with a CDI before? What can we do to educate on how to partner with CDIs for more equitable access? So I think there's that responsibility as a LSP, as a vendor, to make sure that you are educating, but then also respecting wishes when they're asked, because they know their needs better. And the only thing I will say that I would love for the media to stop doing is commenting on how interpreters look when they're interpreting, whether they are deaf or hearing. Our facial expressions, our body languages, all of that is reflective of the person speaking. So when you comment on that, you're criticizing, critiquing, making fun of language, right? And so it's interpreting, you're not really ever going to have a beautiful moment while you're interpreting, but saying, oh, her facial expressions were so big and she was so expressive while interpreting. It's like, well, that's the job. And so that's the only piece I would ask for the media.
The expression is the language.
Right.
So to make fun of, someone being really animated, no, that is the language. That's what you do. So to make fun of that is to make fun of the language.
Yep. And then I posted on my LinkedIn yesterday, I think, for hearing people out in the community that don't know sign language. The next time you see someone using sign language in a video or on Instagram or social media, before you like, share, comment, and just get all excited about it, double check to make sure that's a deaf creator and not just someone who's appropriating language, because there's just so many incredibly talented deaf creators out there using their language to just revolutionize the world and language and culture and art, that the media and just hearing communities can really take a step back and reevaluate before they share and like and comment on how beautiful it is.
Yeah, accepts no imitations. When it comes to deaf creators. All right, let's get into this. I'm running a little bit behind schedule here, but we got some questions from the audience here, and I'm just going to read these. I have not vetted these. So a question for, it looks like you, Shawn, CDI question from Luciana Canestaro, from over in your neck of the woods, over in Boston Children's Hospital. Are there any additional layers of difficulty when a CDI is interpreting for a person who is fluent in an international sign language, such as Russian Sign Language?
There's always an issue in terms of whatever country, whatever background there is, that creates a challenge. most of the time, you're looking for some commonalities in the language. Like, for example, with international signs and gestures, there are some commonalities. You may have to stick with those gestures, look at what they understand, and it may involve a longer process. You know, the provider themselves may kind of see this as a long time of waiting and looking for a response, but it's because we're looking for the best possible way to match their needs and what their language is. So you may have a person who's very skilled within their own language. You know, for example, you may have a spectrum of people with different backgrounds. Maybe they have some access to ASL, but maybe they're from another country and they have access to their own sign language. And so these gestures, different structure, et cetera, oftentimes, you know, the access is in terms of building the language from scratch. You have to figure out what do they understand, what do they not understand, and then work together back and forth with that consumer or patient to do that. You know, and that's providing an inclusive situation for the deaf person where they can build that together and understand. You know, there are often times where we have to double or triple check, and maybe it just doesn't work. Maybe, for example, you know, you have someone who was in a car accident, or someone who maybe struggles to communicate because of different mental health capabilities, and maybe they use eye blinks for yes, no, that kind of thing. And so you're looking to change what you can do to get that yes, no across. And once you're able to ask that of the consumer, and it's like, you know, the whole 20 questions thing, you get down to what the point is. You know, after asking all these different details, you confirm and say, okay, this is what I have, and you can communicate that. So it's endless confirmation, a lot of repetition, and the key is to just really continually check for their understanding. You know, when we talk about mental health, there are people who say they hear voices. And you have to check with them. Are you hearing these voices? Or tinnitus of the ears? You know, anything in terms of residual hearing, different sounds, etc. Or, you know, maybe the person is deaf and understands, and they are able to communicate that. However, you have to make sure that you know whether or not those are voices, etc. You have to know who's saying what. You know, if they're talking about, you know, killing someone, you don't want that to be a huge mistake. You have to make sure that is clear because you're providing that to the provider. And so there's a lot of yes and no and things behind the scenes in terms of ensuring that that happens correctly. When you have certain things in terms of your hearing ability, like tinnitus, or you hear, you know, a kind of specific like beeping or ding, ring in your ears, that's different than someone saying that they hear voices. And so, you know, when we talk about mental health evaluations, that has a tremendous impact on it. You know, if we just pass along, oh, that person's hearing voices, and then before you know it, they're put into a psych hospital and there's no understanding of why, you know, we have to have that ability to match the culture and know whether or not we're correct in that.
And that happens, Tucker. This is Danielle. Like, that happens. That 100% requires a CDI for all the reasons he just said, because that happens.
Well, I read about it in my limited. Sorry, I was trying to come into this like without doing a bunch of research because I want to like ask stupid questions that other people are afraid to. But I'm interested in it, and I did find some examples of particularly heartbreaking children being diagnosed with things that they should not be diagnosed with, and developmental disability. But anyways, let's move on because next question. Sarah Stockler-Rex from Crowdbreak Health asks, what the breakdown of CDI services provided on-site versus remote? What about CDI remote with on-site ASL versus all remote? So the question is, like, do you do this on-site? Do you do it in person? And if off-site, if you're doing it remote, does the ASL interpreter on-site and you're remote, or you're on-site, and how does that work?
I can speak to that. There's really a whole range of possibilities. You may have a hearing interpreter arrive at the hospital, and then they have to pull up a VRI to have that CDI available. And, you know, there are times in which the interpreter is virtual, and, you know, maybe they need a CDI who has to be in person. So there's both situations in which the hospital can do that, and you can team in a variety of ways of someone in person versus virtually. And when they have that virtual access, they usually have that on a stand in which it can move to different environments. And, you know, all ASL done through remote is, you know, a lot of that for me is done remotely. And so that provides a lot of need for me through there. And so oftentimes, you know, when you have the CDI there and they're working with, you know, Claire, would you mind taking it?
Yeah, so
For our hearing audience, we'll be switching interpreters. Perhaps.
yeah, so you might have a situation of a hearing interpreter who goes on site, and there's a ratio of how much work I do, because again, I'm the certified deaf interpreter, and I work full time in front of a computer, and so I'm not going in person very frequently, and so what happens is you might have an interpreter that goes on site, a hearing interpreter. They arrive at that situation. They come to realize it would benefit from having a certified deaf interpreter, and then I'm available to be brought up spontaneously as they need me in those locations. There's other times where the entire process, both teams are virtual, they're on a video remote. And unfortunately, there's times where you have consumers that might be low vision, or they just can't see a screen. It's not a good fit for limitations of the setting. And then you can try to pull up a CDI on screen, so we will work with all sorts of different modalities to try to meet the needs of the consumers, and that can be spontaneously adjusted for situations. Also, I would say with mental health counseling, with people with schizophrenia, with individuals that have dementia, frequently they might be overwhelmed by looking at a screen. They might not understand why they're talking to somebody on a screen because there's that mental health component. And so then that becomes a barrier to communication. It might be intimidating, it might scare them, they might think it's a hallucination. So then technology becomes a barrier, so you have to have an on-site. So we have to work with the consumers and where they're at. So then you might have to reschedule with an on-site interpreter to accommodate their need. If there's a last-minute emergency situation, I get called to all of those situations too. We might have a spontaneous bring me up on the screen, do what we can do. We might have spontaneous get me in sight because it needs to be live. We have to just work with the consumers and tailor it to their needs.
And this is Danielle. I'll add, remote video providers should be providing CDIs on demand, not pre-scheduled. The demand is there, the language needs are there, the agencies are big enough, the resources are available, and the technology, thanks to the pandemic, probably the only silver lining is that technology has just rapidly evolved to make accommodations to see a hearing and deaf interpreter. So there should be CDIs on site, and when they're not available on site for, because it's a 3D language, when they're not available on site, then, refroze. Did you catch that? When they're not available on site, then a VRI vendor should be able to provide remote.
I want to say that again, in case someone missed it, is CDIs should be on demand, not pre-scheduled, because of the situations that we were just talking about. Often, my understanding is you don't understand that you need a CDI until you get to the scene or until you start the conversation, and that's why it may not always be feasible to schedule one ahead of time. Another takeaway that I've taken from listening to Shawn and Danielle here is that the need for deaf interpretation is large. It's more situational, perhaps, than tied to the individual, meaning we like to think of it as, oh, this is a deaf person. They need this. They need ASL interpretation because we're looking at the individual and we're not necessarily looking at the situation. Whereas an individual may be able to make do with standard ASL interpretation for one situation, but dealing with let's say a mental health or the loss of a loved one or a medical emergency could definitely still benefit. So it's not like how come you didn't need a CDI last time, right? Mm-hmm. It's the person should have control. They know their language access needs best. So that's just me recapping.
If you're in the industry, providing language access, then you should be in the business of providing equitable language access. And equitable language access meets the needs of all participants in that situation, not historically what we've done or what we should have done, but in this moment, I'm providing equitable language access, and this moment calls for a CDI.
And I would add, what did I want to say? It slipped my mind. Yes, the point I wanted to make is, across the United States, there are about 250 certified deaf interpreters, and that number is growing, but we're currently at about 250. Some states are rich in CDIs. Some states really struggle to have enough people to cover the work. So we need to get more deaf people certified, because this scarcity of access is going to increase as we have more providers, more certified deaf interpreters that can do the work. Some states don't have CDIs at all, and they're just, or interpreters in general, and they're struggling. And that's another benefit of virtual interpreting options.
Mm-hmm.
We can have people that are appropriately dressed with a good background. And of course, it's beautiful to have people go on site, but it can take time to get a person on site. And a person can only do so many jobs when allowing for travel time in between. And when you've got virtual options, you don't have any drive time, you don't have any time between jobs. So that does spread resources further and more efficiently. If people are very rural, because again, we're servicing the entire state, not just the urban areas that have concentrations of interpreters. When you have to factor in drive time, that's critical for language access. You can pop up a screen right away. And you can schedule more jobs. One competent person can do more work in a day if they're able to work virtually. So that's another way to maximize resources.
This is Tucker. Excellent point. Thanks, Shawn. We're coming to the close here, guys, and I'm saving this. This is a really great question here from Marjorie Bancroft, which is submitted through the KUDO platform. She says, amazing presentation. Thank you. Shawn, would you share the most powerful experience you personally have had while interpreting that highlighted for you the critical role that you play as a CDI? I mean, one that affected you most deeply emotionally. Wow, getting into the personal questions here, Marjorie. To the extent you're comfortable.
I have so many experiences, honestly, every day. I look back at the work that I do, and it's profound. Let me think of one situation I can share with you. There was one situation, interpretation was not successful historically. We had a deaf person that was very resistant, very distrusting. And they said, just so you know, we're going to bring in a certified deaf interpreter. And this person was very antagonistic, very distrusting. And I came on screen and I said, hey, I'm also deaf. Do you mind if I just ask the doctor some questions so I can understand and then I can interpret it? And the consumer said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I got the permission. I took the time. And because it was so messed up when I joined, that distrust was there, that miscommunication was there. It was really antagonistic. And for me to take the time to really understand what was going on from the doctor's perspective and then take the time to give that to the consumer, we untangled that knot. And then we were able to do interpretation, because sometimes you're just handed junk as an interpreter. Mm-hmm. And it's hostile and it's difficult. And so I was able to take all of this information, and in some cases I write it down and I have the whole picture, and I take my time with the consumer to get to the salient points, the part they need to understand, the part that's going to get them caught back up and feeling like they're engaged in the process again, without letting the doctor interrupt them, just letting them get that access. And then we're all caught up to speed. And so I did that. I got the whole thing from the doctor. I gave it to the consumer. We took as much time as we needed. I let them say their piece, which was important. And then I said, you know, and we were talking about putting in a pacemaker, right? And so I said, do you have any more questions? They go, yeah, no, I've got a pacemaker. And I said, okay, now what did I just say? What do you understand? What do you understand? What do you not understand? What was missed beforehand? What do you need? Because it turns out that the other interpreter had been taking over the interpretation and just kind of assuming that everything was understood. And then the time was up and then they would leave. And so you need to not make assumptions. And so I spent my time with the consumer, empowering them, saying, take as much time as you need. I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm not going to end this before it's done. And I had to explain mechanically what a pacemaker is going to do, how it's going to be in there. It's going to be helping the heart. And they didn't know this stuff.
Yeah.
They didn't know there was something wrong with their heart. And so the idea that they get to these appointments and then there's information that's wrong, it builds on itself, it snowballs. And so also the ability to make notes and to help a consumer understand from appointment to appointment, you know, now what's going to happen if your heart stops? What's going to happen if something is wrong? How are we going to fix this next time? Do we want to save your life? Those are kind of the critical pieces. So you're not just interpreting for in the moment, you're interpreting for what happened beforehand, which you need to correct, and setting them up for success in the future. And we were able to note all those things in their chart and know what their rights were. If my heart is to stop, do I want it to, you know, make an electric pulse, restart the heart, have that education piece thoroughly done with them, And then they were able to say, yes, I want these things. And then I told the doctor, yes, this is what they wanted. So instead of this back and forth and fighting and arguing, and the deaf person getting so spun up, like they're taking advantage of me, they're just doing this for the money, they don't care about my life, explaining this is what you have and this is how it's going to help you in the future, and do you want it to help you in these ways? This isn't about exploitation. This isn't about people oppressing deaf people. This is about your choice and what you want. And that's transformative. We got this resolved. It wasn't a fight anymore. They got to walk away. And the impact of that interpretation, resolving it and setting them up for success in the future and telling the doctor what they wanted, getting that to happen, it hadn't happened yet. So knowing that it happened was powerful.
And I'm sure I'm projecting here. This is Tucker. I'm sure that's fascinating because there are not that many CDIs out there. And so to be in a situation where you are the one to have that power between making sure this person understands something so crucial or not, that we need more of you. We need more of you guys out there. But we are fast running out of time here, ladies and gentlemen. So I'd like to go around and let's do a round of closing thoughts, key takeaways. I've already kind of given a spoiler for my key takeaways from this today. But Danielle, why don't we start with you here? And then I'll go, and then Shawn can jump in, close us out.
Sure. I think, as I mentioned before, right, we need to listen to the deaf community when they say they need a CDI. We need to listen to hearing interpreters when they say they need a CDI. And then hearing interpreters, as I said before and Shawn echoed, that, we can be the unfortunate gatekeepers to CDIs being called in and used. And so putting our egos aside and knowing that if you are an interpreter and you're in the business of interpreting, it should be about language access and equity and communicative autonomy, and to really put that ego aside so access can happen, because it's not about me as an interpreter. I've called in CDIs left, right, and center, and I know it's not because I'm a bad interpreter. I actually think it's because I'm a better interpreter for knowing and finding the place at the table for a CDI.
Shawn. Oh, no, me. I said Shawn was going to go after me. I'm sorry. So my takeaways from this, I already gave you guys a big spoiler of this. It's essentially a high level thing. I don't know what I don't know. Like I sit here and, I wrote a book on language, and I have a company that does research and analysis into the language services industry. So it is not it is not a small amount of damage that has been done to my ego, having learned more about sign language interpreting, because here I thought I was a language industry guy. And there's this whole world out there that is just so fascinating and so crucial. And I really thank Danielle, firstly, because I met her recently, and she's been crucial in educating me about this, and a big part of how she's done that is to introduce me to Shawn. So Shawn, I'll turn it over to you for closing words, and then I'll take care of some logistical items, and we'll call her a day.
Sure. In general, let's talk about requesting a CDI. People are going to work so hard, and your brains over time get fatigued with that workload. Having a CDI there is almost like putting on a life jacket, because you can trust each other. The team can work together to make sure that there's even more language access. And when you've got a consumer that has needs, having a team there together, they get to share resources, they get to work together, both of them, to make sure that that interpretation is effective. And it's not about this one person did this and this one person did that. You're working as a team, and you get to share in that success. It's not about me, it's not about you, it's about us, and it's about the communication facilitation happening. So I want to say, a skilled interpreter, when an interpreter calls for a certified deaf interpreter or a deaf interpreter, they call me because they're skilled, and they call me because they value and they've got heart invested in seeing what happens well. So it's not about ego, it's not about your work, it's not about the self, it's about supporting one another and being effective and building on that success, taking yourself out of the situation and just recognizing that what is key is all of the skills coming together and making a beautiful whole. So please be willing to call for us. We're here. We want to help. We want to be in that team.
Mm-hmm.
I have nothing to add to that. So thank you very, very much. On behalf of myself, on behalf of Nimdzi Insights, on behalf of MultiLingual Media, I'd like to thank you, Shawn and Danielle, for agreeing to take part in this very important conversation that we have today. I started this off by saying I didn't want to raise awareness. I wanted to promote normalcy. I wanted to normalize, right? And I think there's a subtle difference there because, you know, we need to learn how to work together as communities. And with language services being such a bit important part of my background for my entire career, it's like I thought that I've spent my entire career bringing people together across different groups. And it was just recently that I found out that there's this whole group of people that was off my radar. So it is my hope that this panel today has, you know, normalized this a little bit, maybe educated some people about the existence of what deaf interpretation is and why it is needed. So,
and if I can add, I know we're almost out of time, but if I can add, you have spoken language so siloed from sign language, right? When we talk about language access, especially, you know, on your side of the business, right? It's in big vendor companies, it's always spoken. But if we can bring them together, these gaps won't happen because there's so much to learn, spoken to sign and sign to spoken, including CDIs, that we all serve the same goal, which is equitable language access. And we just happen to use sign language and you happen to speak another language. And so breaking those silos. And that's why I was really happy and very grateful that MultiLingual agreed to have us here so that we can give a platform to sign language and CDIs within a very large platform that the spoken language community turns to. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, this has been the second installment of the 2021 Multilingual Summer Series, where we host conversations with thought leaders in globalization, localization, language access, translation, interpretation, and all things language. We've already thanked our hosts, Shawn Vriezen and Danielle Meder. I would also like to once again thank our working interpreters, Ree and Claire, who have made this possible. Our gold sponsor, as well, deserves thanks, XTM. Thank you very much for making this series possible. We have a lot more exciting events lined up in the Multilingual Season Series, so make sure to visit multilingual.com for more information, and also make sure to follow MultiLingual Media on social to be up to date as we announce new events. With that, I will sign you. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care.